just for once, everything was going right for Vincent van Gogh. He'd just sold his first painting, and he'd been hailed by the critics as the genius of the future.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most credible voice in true crime. In the opening clip you heard a slightly different version of Simon Sharma talking about Vincent van Gogh. He starts off by saying just for once everything was going right for Vincent van Gogh. What is missing from that, I don't want to be mean, but to contextualize that, one's got to provide a date. So when you say, just for once everything was going right, when are we talking about? And it's likely that you're sort of talking about right now. In other words, around about mid-February 1890. So around about this time, 130 years ago. I wouldn't say it's exactly mid-February because the article in the Mercure by Albert Aurier came out in January, and then he sold his first painting, or the news of this first painting came out in February. So let's just say January and February. At face value, when you hear Sharma talking about this, it sounds accurate, doesn't it? He talks about he just sold his first painting and he'd been hailed by the critics. In this episode, I want to deal with the first part of that. So the first part being that he'd sold his first painting, right? Being around about January, February 1890, okay? And we're going to just think about that. And also, so he sold his first painting around about 6 months before he committed suicide. So he's been an artist for maybe 10 years. He started painting when he was 27. And he died at about 37 years of age. So at the time that he's achieving some success, he commits suicide. In any event, what we want to just address here is this idea that he sold his first painting early on in the year, the last year of his life. Was that the one and only painting he sold? In other words, for the rest of that time, did he not sell another painting? And so if we want to crystallize this down to a single question, the question we're really asking is, how many paintings did Van Gogh sell in his life? And if you go to Google, you'll go to one of the sort of earlier mythologies around this, which is that Van Gogh never sold any paintings. So an article written almost exactly 5 years ago, just published February the 14th, 2015 in The Spectator, a British publication. And it was in the art, news and review section. It was to publicize an exhibition. And so there's a fairly recent indication of quite an authoritative publication spreading the false rumor that he never sold any paintings. In recent times, the law, the mythology around how many paintings Van Gogh sold has changed slightly. It's now gone up from 0 to 1. And there was, as recently as October 2019, a little expose by MSN talking about that. That's since been removed online. But I think if you ask most people, how many paintings did Van Gogh sell? Maybe not most people, but many people. I think it's fairly well known, or it's fairly popularly known, that he sold one painting. And the painting that is held up as the one painting that he sold in his life is the Red Vineyard. And he sold it for 400 francs 7 months before his death. And again, you must consider what you're talking about. It's a guy who struggled with poverty and struggled with wanting to be recognized as an artist. And then at the beginning of 1890, around about this time, 130 years ago, he sells this particular painting for quite a lot of money. A suit cost, I think, about 35 francs, so you could buy around about 10 suits if you wanted to with that money, even more. So you've got to ask, if he'd kind of made a breakthrough, what does he have to be upset about? What does he have to be troubled about? And we will see in his letters that as a result of this sale, he wants to leave the asylum. He's got money to leave. He's inspired. He's happy. He's been given a boost by this sale. So you can make the argument that he was a troubled artist, that he was mad, whatever, but if anything, his mood had to have been lifted the most in his entire life as an artist by this seminal moment, the sale of this picture. But we kind of start finding ourselves in a difficult spot when it turns out, and this comes from liveabout.com, which doesn't seem a very necessarily well-known and potentially credible source, but nevertheless it says Van Gogh sold only one painting during his life, but it's kind of abbreviated by the law. In other words, the legend, the myth. And the article then goes on to show that that's not the case, that he didn't sell only one painting. As always, I'll put a link in the description so you can read these articles yourself. But if you go to Lust for Life, there's a depiction of this particular scene, painting the vineyards. This is just north, I think, of Arles, and it was the vineyards, I think, in the late autumn. It was when the vineyards had sort of turned red. And that's depicted in Lust for Life. But I can tell you something. One thing they don't depict in Lust for Life is any sign of success, any sign of him selling anything. And that's why Van Gogh is depicted in Lust for Life going through this teeth-grinding misery of, I'm painting and painting and painting. I just can't sell anything. I can't sell a single painting. Well, he did sell this painting. So we've gone from he never sold a single painting to he sold one painting in the last 7 months of his life. Then we go to the Baltimore Sun, and it refers on February 15th, 1890, to Van Gogh writing to his mother that Theo had written him about the painting and the price, and this is a reference to the Red Vineyard. I don't think that's accurate. There's no letter either way, either to Vincent or from him, on February 15th. There is a letter on the 19th. So that reference is incorrect. If you went to look for it, if you were researching this, and you went to look for it, you wouldn't be able to find it. There's an article out right now, it's currently sort of circulating through the media, about a painting that is supposed to be Vincent van Gogh's first ever painting, and sort of a peasant woman outside a barn, and this is supposed to be his first ever painting. and it was apparently painted when he was about 33 years old. But he actually started painting when he was 27, so 6 years earlier than that. So yeah, you have a painting that I think originally sold for £4 or $5, and it's been called the first painting by Van Gogh, but it wasn't. It wasn't the first painting. And you can actually go through his art and look at how clumsy his original efforts were, how dark and poorly executed they were. So this definitely wasn't his first painting, but of course, to come now and say, well, it was the first painting, it also now gets that sort of incredible prestige of, wow, this is the first painting ever painted. Wow. It must be really, really valuable, right? If you go to Martin Bailey's article on this particular image, nowhere in the article will he say anything about it being the first Van Gogh, and in the Daily Mail it's kind of in inverted commas as the first ever. So you can see how there's a little bit of mischief in the descriptions. But let's return to the Baltimore Sun. In a book called The Essential Vincent van Gogh, written by critic and curator Ingrid Schaffner and published by Harry N. Abrams, fairly recently, Schaffner quotes art historian Everett van Uitert. So it's basically a book written by Schaffner, and Schaffner quoting another art historian. And what Everett van Uitert says is, in the popular view, Van Gogh has become the prototype of the misunderstood, tormented artist who sold only one work in his lifetime. But as it turns out, this popular view is actually prototypical of people who misunderstand, people, I guess, who are tormented, and people who are maybe, struggling to sell themselves in their own lives. In other words, it's a victim psychology celebrated by other people who see themselves as victims. So elsewhere in the same article from the Baltimore Sun, it refers to Louis van Tilburg, the chief curator at the Van Gogh Museum. Now you'd think this guy is going to shed light on this topic. You know, if anyone's going to know the scientific data on this, it's going to be this guy, right? He lent paintings for the National Gallery show, and this is what he has to say about it. And this is a quote from Van Tilburg. He says, somewhere in his own letters, he mentions that he sold a portrait to somebody. And then he adds, the work Vincent mentioned was a portrait, not a self-portrait. But what portrait is not known. So I love the way this art expert can't be bothered to tell you where in the letters or which letter, and it's very vague. So all that he really says is, somewhere he mentions that he sold a portrait to somebody. So I guess we are now at 2. So he sold at least two paintings in his life, right? Or 2 artworks in his life. We've gone from 0 to 1, and now we're at 2. And that's basically the headline of this Baltimore Sun article, which came out quite a long time ago. I mean, it's dated October 25th, 1998. So it predates that article in The Spectator by 17 years. And it talks about the Van Gogh legend, that there's a different picture to how we know this guy. And how there's the story about him that endures despite the reality being quite different. And again, it just shows you the power of that lust for life psychology, which infected, I guess, the boomers and has stayed with us ever since. And I guess all that one can say when you hear this crap about Van Gogh is, okay, boomer. So I've just quoted from a quote from a curator at the Van Gogh Museum, and what I'm going to take you to now is an actual posting on the Van Gogh Museum website. So it's vangoghmuseum.co.nl. And this is a page from that website where someone has asked how many paintings did Vincent sell during his lifetime. So this is it. This is the official version of it, okay? And it apparently comes from someone called Luca Müller, who asks about this. And this is the official statement from the Van Gogh Museum. Are you ready? We don't know exactly how many paintings Van Gogh sold during this lifetime. Wow. Wow, okay, so the answer is we don't know. So it's not 0, it's not 1, it's not 2, it's kind of we don't know. The official version from the most authoritative area when it comes to Van Gogh, you know, the folks representing him, they don't know. Surely in 130 years you could just answer that question. How many paintings did he sell when he was alive? How hard could that be for a guy who'd written over 900 letters? Surely he's going to write, whenever he sold a picture, he's going to write a letter about that. How hard would it be to research? So going back to the post, he says, in any case, it was more than a couple. Oh, that sounds like it's more than 1 or 2. So it looks like we've now gone from 0 to 1 to 2 to more than 2. And then continuing to quote from the article, Vincent's first commission was from his uncle Gogh. He was an art dealer and wanted to help his nephew on his way. So he ordered 19 cityscapes of The Hague. Wow. So it's gone from 0 to 1 to 2 to 19 plus about 2. So we're now at 21. 21 artworks. Just, can you see how far that whole idea of him never sending a picture or only sending one picture in his whole life is receding down the road? Can you see how it's almost like out of sight? So now it's like 21 artworks. And then it goes on to say, Vincent sold his first painting to the Parisian paint and art dealer Julien Tanguy. So that's another one we haven't heard about. So we are now at 22, I guess. And then his brother successfully sold another work to a gallery in London. And that's the Red Vineyard. So only in the second paragraph is it acknowledged that the one picture that everyone's been talking about is now one of many. And that is quite well known. It was painted in 1888, bought by Anna Gogh, the sister of Vincent's friend Eugene Gogh. And that was a portrait. And he painted that portrait when Eugene visited him in Arles. But the answer isn't quite done yet. It talks about Van Gogh trading work with other artists in his younger years in exchange for some food or drawing and painting supplies. And then it concludes by saying, in this sense, Vincent actually sold quite a lot of work during his lifetime. And we know that even Dr. Gogh took a number of Vincent van Gogh's artwork as payment for his sort of medical services. This was shortly after he died. So you could say, well, okay, that was sold just after he died, right? But this was kind of going on all the time. When he lived somewhere, he would pay in portraits. He would paint someone's portraits, and that would serve as a kind of payment. There wouldn't be cash exchanged. There would be the painting itself exchanged for food, accommodation, clothes, whatever. So this changes things quite drastically. So now you kind of get the idea that the art really was a kind of currency that was helping him on his way. And it wasn't like it was no paintings or one. It's now going into the double figures. Can you see how the myths and the storytelling around Van Gogh are misleading? And can you see how telling the story and insisting that it was only one painting just emphasizes the value of his artwork today even more. That contrast, that, oh, he could never sell a painting, he was so anguished and troubled, but today he is recognized and it's now worth millions and millions and millions. The bigger the contrast, the more you kind of can push that value chain. Do you see how there's an incentive to providing the worst version? If it's more horrible than you thought, it must be true. The irony of all this is, if you go to Van Gogh's letters, and there's an incredible archive of his own writing there, and you get a lot of information from his own hand, you would expect to find confirmation of a lot of these sales, right? And to some extent you do, but if we go to 130 years ago today, and we try and source something about Vincent writing to Theo, right? You'd imagine this would be quite an incredible letter where he's saying, woohoo, yee-haw, I'm so glad, this is so awesome, I'm the happiest guy in the world, except that letter is just not around. Where is it? So we know that he sold this painting. We know where he was when he sold it. He was in the asylum. We know it was recorded in early March in an account book. We know how much was paid for it. We know all about that. But then you say, hold on, where's the letter talking about it? I mean, surely, there's no way Vincent van Gogh, who is writing so many letters, wouldn't have written about this. But then that letter is missing. And then you've got to ask yourself, why is that letter missing? Hello, he's written hundreds of letters. Why is, like, one of the most important letters, one of them saying, how happy I am that I've sold a painting? Where's that letter? And so if you go into the letters archive, online, it says explicitly, the letter in which Theo reported this to Vincent is not known. The letter in which Theo told Vincent that he'd sold a painting is not known. Why not? Surely, if there's so many letters recovered, wouldn't Vincent have kept that particular letter? I mean, it was a massive milestone for him. It was a huge moment. In 10 years of painting feverishly, intensely, passionately, losing his ear over it, going to the madhouse over it, he finally makes a breakthrough, but he doesn't keep the letter. Now, in researching this particular topic, I came across, I think it was one of the curators or some other art expert who said, listen here, kind of holding up his hand, saying, listen here, the point is Van Gogh didn't sell a lot of art in his life. Yeah, that is the point. But the point is also, and this is from a true crime rocket science perspective, hey guys, can we try and get the details right? Can we try and get beyond he sold one painting his entire life to no, he didn't. He sold quite a lot of art in his entire life. And this is where we start getting into the area of, was he as troubled and as a miserable failure as everyone has made him out to be? I mean, he was a struggling artist. But was he as miserable? Was he the miserable shit that everyone's making him out to be? I don't think so. Especially at this time when, the one and only art critic that was singing his praises had just sung his praises and now he sold an artwork. It looks like things have finally turned for Vincent van Gogh. And I want to encourage you to go back to the beginning of this video and play that little hypnotic refrain from Simon Sharma, another art expert, art historian. And just play it back and listen to what he says. Listen carefully.
Just for once, everything was going right for Vincent van Gogh. He'd just sold his first painting, and he'd been hailed by the critics as the genius of the future.
So can you see how that opening refrain, while it feels true and it certainly resonates, I don't know if it is factually true. I don't think that is the first painting he'd sold, and he hadn't been hailed by critics plural. He'd been hailed for the first time by a critic. And that is why it's crucial to provide a date, because if you provide a date, you can say, okay, we're talking about January, early February 1890, and the critic in question is Gogh, and we're still going to deal with him. But in terms of the one picture sold, well, there was the one of the Red Vineyard, but that was by no means the first picture sold. And by sketching it in vague terms, you're not thinking about it like that. And that is why you sometimes need true crime rocket science in areas where the information is fudgy, blurry, indistinct, where there's kind of a persistent mythology surrounding something. And, if you want to find out something, pay attention to it, look closely at it, get the facts, get the information, and then most important, start working on the true identity of the person you're talking about, and stop basing what you think on the suppositions of others who've also built their suppositions on others. Bear in mind there's an incentive to the Van Gogh legend. And what is the incentive? Well, financial, of course. The more Van Gogh suffered and struggled, the more unsuccessful he was in life, the more incredible his story, and thus the more valuable his art today, and the more compelling his legend. The more people associate with that kind of victim psychology. The thing is, it's not true. And are we on this planet to be lied to, sort of with smiles? Do we want people smiling at us while lying to us? Or do we want to know the truth about the things that we hold dear, about the stories that mean a lot to us? Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying this series, please subscribe. I will be putting up the promised article from Albert Gogh, which just gives one an idea of Vincent's character, which is really important. It's someone else, an outsider pontificating about his character. And then we're going to look at Vincent's response to that in a letter to his mother, where he talks about what this guy says about his character, how he responded, and then how he changed his mind afterwards, which I think is also quite interesting. That is allowing us to get to know him contextually, but also quite intimately. In terms of the Chris Watts case, and I want to keep making analogies between Van Gogh and Chris Watts, even though you might think it's very different, but just as there are two faces to Chris Watts, there are also two faces to Vincent van Gogh. There's the face of this absolutely tortured artist, and then there's his true face. And to some extent, Van Gogh himself is part of that twisting of how we perceive him. And I'll explain that in due course as well. If you head on to Patreon, you'll see a video about dealing with the sensitive issue of the family dynamics, as I covered in episode 13 of What Else Do We Know? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.